We have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals.
Can you imagine these people, these animals over in the Middle East that chop off heads, sitting around talking and seeing that we're having a hard problem with waterboarding? We should go for waterboarding and we should go tough.
And this is why we call the bloodthirsty MS-13 gang members exactly the name that I used last week. What was the name? Animals.
Over the past week, I've talked with a lot of people about the word animal. The experts included a sociolinguist, a neuroscientist, a philosophy professor, and historian Ibram X. Kendi. As a historian, what goes through your head when you hear President Trump using terms like animal to refer to people?
Well, what goes through my head is that those are indicative of racist ideas. And throughout the history of racist ideas, certain races have been characterized, or I should say dehumanized, as in some ways animal-like.
Dr. Kendi won the National Book Award 2 years ago for his book Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And he says in order to establish human hierarchy, humans have been calling other humans animals for a long time. 2,000 years ago, Aristotle was doing this. There were the Greeks and then the non-Greeks. Greeks were human, non-Greeks were barbarians, animals who needed civilizing. But this idea of racial hierarchy, Dr. Kendi says, that really started taking shape around the 1400s with the transatlantic slave trade and dehumanizing language penned by a Portuguese biographer.
Gomes Zurara. Gomes Zurara ended up being commissioned to write a biography of Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator really pioneered the transatlantic sort of African slave trade. So he sort of financed the Portuguese to sort of go around the Muslim middlemen through the Sahara and use the Atlantic to then go and enslave people and bring them back to Europe, and eventually started bringing them to the Americas. And so when the king asked Gomes Zurara to write a biography of the king's uncle, which was Prince Henry, he, of course, had to write a glowing biography. And in writing a glowing biography, he ended up describing the reason why Prince Henry was enslaving these people was not to make money, but was to civilize them because they were beasts. And so I write about this and show this in my book, from the original pioneering Portuguese slave traders to the French to the British. These travelers and thinkers were typically describing the Black people they were enslaving as beasts to justify their expeditions, to justify their mass murdering and kidnapping of these people.
After the abolition of slavery in the U.S. in 1865, free Black men were depicted as ferocious animals out to rape and devour white women. Thousands of people were lynched. Native Americans were referred to as savages, wolves, lice, to be exterminated. The justification for ripping Native American families apart and forcing children into boarding schools came from Captain Richard H. Pratt's speech, "Kill the Indian and save the man," delivered in 1892. The Chinese were also considered uncivilized and referred to as filthy yellow hordes ahead of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and we're going to get to more on that in a bit. And the Japanese were referred to as devils ahead of their internment during World War II. In the 1950s, signs could be found in the windows of businesses across the American Southwest reading, "No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans." The list is long and it's hideous, and it's still being added to. Sociolinguist Otto Santana, a professor in the Chicano-Chicana Studies Department at UCLA, analyzed the language about Mexican immigrants used by the Los Angeles Times between June of 1992 and December of 1994.
And what I found was that the metaphors used to characterize immigrants were systematically negative. The major one was immigrants as animals. They were They were pack animals, they were coyotes, they were pollos, they were any number of animals. The Border Patrol were hunting those animals, they were tracking them down, they were caging them, they were eliminating them.
Professor Santana told me the LA Times journalists were not only quoting people using this type of language, they were using the metaphors themselves. And during that time, on November 8th, 1994, California voters passed Proposition 187. People who backed the legislation, like California Republican Governor Pete Wilson, called it the Save Our State Initiative. Opponents called it racist and anti-immigrant. It stopped all unauthorized immigrants in California from accessing non-emergency health care, public education, and other social services. And the law required folks who worked at agencies that provided these services to report people they thought might be undocumented to the INS, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Now, Prop 187 was declared unconstitutional, but Professor Santana says the U.S. in 2018 feels eerily similar to California in 1994. And President Trump's rhetoric is giving him deja vu.
By allowing and by utilizing the term illegal alien and criminal alien, which is his favorite term, he, again, legitimizes the discourse in the public sphere that demeans and dehumanizes immigrants.
Professor Santana says illegal alien, criminal alien, animal, they're all bad. They're all describing a group of people as not human.
Animals. When he characterizes them as animals, that reflects a concept that was used by the Nazis when they characterized Jews in 1930s. That led, of course, to the Holocaust. When you dehumanize a person entirely, then you're able to eradicate them without concern. That's why good family-oriented people are willing to rip children out of the arms of those animals, because those Latinos are not people in the way that good Americans are.
Now, there are people who think that comparing President Trump's language to the language of Nazis is hyperbolic. It's offensive, and it's useless. One of those people is The Hill's media reporter, Joe Concha. Concha says that so much of the news media has taken Trump's animal reference way out of context. He says that the president was referring to MS-13 gang members, not all Latino immigrants. I caught up with him on his cell phone while he was making his way back home to New Jersey from D.C.
When President Trump compares MS-13 to animals, they are. They really are. They decapitate people. They rape people. They're a horrible, horrible existence on this planet. And if anybody but Trump says it, no one even blinks twice when that is said. Didn't Hillary Clinton once call gang members,
super predators.
Yeah, exactly.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And the president has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere.
Historian Ibram Kendi, who you heard from earlier, says dehumanizing people is totally bipartisan. In fact, everyone is susceptible to using this type of language.
There's a long history of abolitionists using this language, civil rights activists using this language, liberals using this language. I mean, to give an example, during the enslavement era, one of the more popular theories that abolitionists put forth was that slavery was literally making Black people into brutes. So it wasn't just dehumanizing, it literally had dehumanized them and made them into brutes. And so that's why slavery is so bad. We need to eliminate it. It's made these people into animals. And the same idea has been made about segregation, about poverty. People who uttered the idea that young Black urban teenagers were super predators weren't saying that this was sort of by nature. They were saying that's the result of poverty. It's the result of discrimination. So we need to, eliminate those problems so we can sort of heal them and civilize them back to humanity.
And it turns out everyone is susceptible to believing other people are subhuman. I spoke with Emile Bruneau, a neuroscientist and director of the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab, and he helped conduct a study to test this. First, he showed people the ascent of man diagram. That's the one that supposedly shows how human beings evolved. It goes from apes to advanced humans. You've seen it. And what he did was he let people rate certain groups of people, rate their humanity from 0 to 100 on that diagram, 0 being the least human, the ape, and 100 being the most human. And when he gave that study to Americans, Muslims and what Bruneau refers to as Muslim-related groups, like Iranians and Palestinians, they scored 10 to 15 points below white Americans. So they were considered less human. And it was Americans of all races and ethnic backgrounds who scored Muslims this way.
If the media and the norms of a society are all biased against one group, then all groups in the society learn that, including the group that's at the losing end.
Bruneau found that the people who rated Muslims lowest on that scale, they were more likely to say they were against the Iran nuclear accord and for the torture of terror suspects. As for differentiating between an MS-13 gang member and a Central American immigrant, it's actually harder than you think. Bruneau says human beings' brains are kind of pre-wired to attribute negative things to other groups. That's our brains on autopilot. So he says if you're not a part of that racial, ethnic, or religious group, the automatic response in your brain will conflate the gang member who was just called an animal with all the other members of that group, or the Muslim terrorist being hunted down with all Muslims.
And one simple example, I've been looking at the tendency to collectively blame groups for the actions of individual extremists from those groups. Mm-hmm. And Americans, if you ask them how responsible are Muslims in general for an attack by a Muslim extremist, they will say about 35 to 40 points on a 100-point scale. If you ask white Americans how responsible are white Americans for the action of a white extremist like Dylan Roof, they'll answer about 10 on the scale. So there's an extreme difference in how much they apply the actions of extreme group members to the group as a whole.
Bruneau is conducting studies right now to figure out the best ways to jolt the human brain out of these automatic responses and into deliberate cognition. He says, based on what scientists know about how the brain works, he's pretty sure shaming someone for their beliefs and making them feel bad is not the way to do it. I spoke with David Livingston Smith more about this. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of New England, and he's author of Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. He thinks one way to wake Americans up to the evils of dehumanization is to teach us our history, an unsanitized version of it.
Americans tend to have a rather deformed picture of their own history. Mm-hmm. And so we're not so acquainted, like the Germans are, with the atrocities that, white America has committed. If you're aware of those things, then it might give you pause. I teach a course called Race, Racism, and Beyond. Mm-hmm. And without exception, my students have never heard how bad things were. The loss of flattering illusions is a very painful process. Mm-hmm. It is for all of us. And, I have compassion with that, but it would be very beneficial because it might actually result in some dramatic improvement in the nightmare of race relations in this country.